In a quiet town, Sophie, a young girl, finds herself facing an unexpected danger. But in the midst of it all, a stray dog named Shadow appears, changing her life forever. With loyalty and bravery, Shadow protects Sophie from harm, and together they form an unbreakable bond. Join us in this heartwarming tale of love, courage, and the bond between a girl and her dog. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to our channel to start today's story with life stories. Let's dive into this incredible journey together. It was an ordinary afternoon in Maple Ridge, a quaint little town where everyone knew each other's names and the rhythm of life was slow and steady. The streets were lined with maple trees, their leaves just beginning to turn orange and gold as autumn whispered its arrival. The sun was starting its descent, casting a warm glow across the town and dipping the sky into hues of pink and purple. Lily Johnson, a bright-eyed 7-year-old with wild brown hair and a much too big red hoodie, was walking home from school. The smell of freshly baked bread from the local bakery drifted in the air, mingling with the crisp autumn scent of fallen leaves. Lily's shoes scuffed the pavement as she skipped along the sidewalk, her thoughts far from where they should be. Most of the other kids had already rushed home, eager to get away from school and into the comfort of their own homes. But not Lily. She had a tendency to wander, often taking the same route that led her through the empty lot near the old train tracks. It wasn't the most exciting route, but there was something peaceful about the silence of the lot. It felt like her own little secret world, where no one could interrupt her thoughts. But that afternoon, something caught her eye as she approached the lot. It was subtle at first, a strange movement in the weeds by the edge of the lot. Something that didn't quite belong. She stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat as she squinted to get a better look. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a pile of rags, tangled in the overgrown weeds. But then, it shifted. A pair of sad, weary eyes stared back at her from beneath a tangle of matted black and tan fur. Lily's heart skipped a beat. The shape of the creature was unmistakable, a dog. But it was no ordinary dog. It was a large German shepherd, its frame thin and skeletal, with ribs clearly visible beneath its scruffy coat. One ear drooped, and there was a faint cut above its eye, dried blood crusting around the edges. Its eyes, dark and full of a mixture of suspicion and sadness, seemed to tell 1,000 stories of hardship. Lily instinctively took a step back, her hand tightening around the strap of her backpack. She remembered what her parents always told her: stay away from strange dogs. Don't approach animals you don't know. But as she stood there, gazing at the creature before her, something tugged at her heart. She could see the hunger in the dog's eyes, and a deep, unspoken sadness that seemed to resonate with her own quiet loneliness. For a moment, the dog didn't move. Its gaze never left hers, watching her with a sense of careful judgment, as if weighing whether she was a friend or a threat. Lily took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice soft and unsure. But the dog didn't budge. Its body remained stiff, and Lily could tell it wasn't sure whether to trust her. And yet, there was something in the dog's eyes that made her want to help, something that told her this dog hadn't always been a stray. That maybe, just maybe, he had once had a home, a family. Lily's stomach gave a sudden growl, reminding her of the half-eaten peanut butter and jelly sandwich she had left in her lunchbox. She glanced around quickly, making sure no one was watching. Then, without thinking, she set her backpack on the ground and rummaged through it, pulling out the sandwich, still wrapped in crinkled foil. "You can have it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she held it out toward the dog. At first, the dog didn't move, his body still tense with caution. But after a few moments, it cautiously sniffed the air, its nose twitching. Slowly, the dog stretched his neck forward, sniffing the sandwich, his hunger overtaking his hesitation. And then, with a sense of urgency, he snatched the food from her hand and devoured it. The quick, desperate way he ate, breaking Lily's heart. It was clear that this dog had been without food for a long time. "You're really hungry." "Huh," Lily said softly, her voice breaking as she watched him eat. She sat down cross-legged beside him, feeling an overwhelming sense of responsibility wash over her. This wasn't just any stray dog. This was a dog who had once belonged to someone, who had once been loved and cared for. How had he ended up here? Abandoned and alone in the cold, desolate lot. "You need a name," Lily murmured, thinking out loud as she watched the dog. His coat, black and tan, glinted in the soft light of the setting sun, and she realized that his presence reminded her of the shadows that stretched long across the yard at the end of the day. "I'll call you Shadow. Do you like that?" she asked, almost to herself. The dog paused, his ears twitching at the sound of her voice. Lily swore she saw a flicker of something in his tired brown eyes, perhaps trust, perhaps understanding. For the first time since she had found him, he looked at her not with suspicion but with a quiet acceptance. Lily smiled, feeling a small warmth bloom in her chest. "I'll come back tomorrow," she promised, her voice gentle but filled with determination. "I'll bring more food." "Okay." Shadow watched her with those deep, soulful eyes, and for a moment, it seemed as though he was holding her to that promise. The sound of her mother calling from down the street broke the moment, and Lily turned quickly, glancing at the dog one last time. "I'll be back," she whispered, before turning to run home, her heart heavy with the weight of the promise she had just made. Shadow lowered his head onto his paws, his breathing steady now, his ribs no longer the most prominent feature of his body. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't completely alone, and Lily, as she ran back to the safety of her home, knew that something had changed. She wasn't just going to help a stray dog. She was going to help a dog who had already started to change her life. The next day, Lily awoke with a sense of purpose. It wasn't the usual rush to get dressed and head out the door to school. Today, her thoughts were consumed by Shadow. She couldn't shake the image of his tired, hungry eyes. She knew that she had to keep her promise. As she pulled on her school uniform, her mind raced with ideas of how to help the dog who had been left alone in the lot, abandoned and neglected. Downstairs, her mother was busy preparing breakfast. The usual hum of the kitchen filled the house, sizzling eggs, the soft clink of the spoon against the cereal bowl. But Lily couldn't focus on the conversation that was happening around her. Instead, her eyes flickered to the clock on the wall. She was waiting for the moment when she could break free and rush to the lot to see Shadow again. Her father, John, was sitting at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper as he sipped his coffee. "Lily, you all right, kiddo?" he asked, looking up from his paper, sensing her distracted demeanor. Lily nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just thinking about a project for school," she replied, her voice soft. "Well, finish your breakfast, and we'll talk about it later," her mother, Mary, said gently, setting a plate of eggs in front of her. But Lily's mind was already elsewhere, picturing the lot and the space where Shadow had been waiting for her. She quickly finished her meal, excused herself from the table, and grabbed her backpack. Her mother called out, reminding her to walk carefully to school. But Lily's heart wasn't in the school day ahead. All she could think about was Shadow. Once she stepped outside, the chilly autumn air wrapped around her. But the briskness didn't dampen her excitement. She was eager to see him again, to bring him something better than the sandwich from yesterday. As she passed through the familiar streets of Maple Ridge, she couldn't help but notice the beauty of the town she had grown up in. The houses were neat, and the trees were bursting with color. Yet, there was a feeling of loneliness that seemed to cling to her as she walked, one that seemed to mirror the dog's own isolation. When she reached the lot, she slowed her pace, scanning the area. There, by the old barrel where she had last seen him, sat Shadow. This time, he didn't look as anxious as before. His head was raised, ears perked, and his eyes locked onto hers as she approached. The moment they made eye contact, Lily felt a rush of warmth. It was as if the two of them shared an understanding, a bond that didn't need words. "Hey, Shadow," she said softly, smiling as she kneeled down to her backpack. "I brought you something better today." She pulled out a piece of chicken, still warm from her mother's dinner last night. She had carefully wrapped it up, just like she had the sandwich the day before. Shadow sniffed the air as the rich smell of the chicken reached his nose. The dog hesitated at first, as if not sure whether to trust her. But when Lily sat down on the grass and unwrapped the food, placing it a few inches away from her, Shadow's body relaxed. He sniffed the food, his nose twitching. Then slowly, cautiously, he bent down and began to eat. His movements were more measured this time, not as frantic as the day before. There was a calmness to the way he ate, almost as if he had begun to feel safe around her. Lily watched him, her heart swelling with affection. "You're getting stronger, aren't you?" she said quietly, reaching out to touch his fur. His coat, though still matted in places, seemed to be filling out, and his tail wagged faintly, a small sign of his growing comfort. As Shadow finished the food, he lifted his head and looked at Lily, his eyes soft. She couldn't help but feel that he was thanking her in his own way. There was no doubt in her mind now, this dog wasn't just a stray. He was a survivor. And somehow, they were meant to cross paths. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" she whispered, gently scratching behind his ears. The dog closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, his muscles slowly relaxing. Lily sat with him for a while, just talking to him about her day at school, about how she was doing on her art project, about how she wished she could take him home, but she knew her parents wouldn't approve. Still, she made him another promise. "I'll keep bringing you food, Shadow. Every day, if I can. You don't have to be alone anymore." Shadow seemed to understand. His tail wagged more vigorously, and for the first time, Lily thought she saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes, a flicker of something that told her he was beginning to trust her. As the bell rang in the distance, signaling that school was about to begin, Lily stood up, her backpack slung over her shoulder. "I have to go now," she said, looking back at the dog. "But I'll come back tomorrow. I promise." Shadow watched her go, and for the first time since their meeting, he didn't appear as sad or afraid. He sat back down by the barrel, his head lifted slightly, as if waiting for her to return. Lily glanced over her shoulder one last time before walking toward the school. Her heart was lighter now. She had made a friend, a quiet companion who needed her as much as she needed him. She didn't know yet where this path would lead, but she knew that somehow, this was only the beginning of something special, something that would change both their lives. And as she walked toward school, the thought of Shadow waiting for her in the lot kept a soft smile on her face. It was more than a promise, it was a connection. The following days passed in a quiet rhythm, the kind that feels like the calm before a storm. Every morning, Sophie would wake up early, tiptoeing downstairs to grab a sandwich or some leftover scraps from dinner. She would carefully pack them into her backpack, making sure her parents didn't notice. Her heart beat with excitement as she prepared for her daily visit to the lot. Each time, she would sneak away from school, careful to leave before her parents asked questions or noticed her absence. The lot had become Sophie's secret sanctuary, a place where the bond between her and Shadow deepened with each passing day. Shadow was there, always waiting for her when she arrived. His coat had begun to shine with the nourishment she brought him. His ribs, once painfully visible, now seemed less pronounced. Every day, Sophie noticed the gradual transformation of the dog. His once wary eyes now held a glimmer of trust. They had fallen into a comfortable routine. Sophie would arrive, and Shadow would be there, watching her with those steady, intelligent eyes. He had begun following her around the lot, sticking close to her like a shadow, but without the usual wariness. He seemed to understand that Sophie had become his protector. But Sophie also began to realize something. It wasn't just the dog who needed saving. It was her, too. The days had started to feel heavier, like something was looming just beyond the horizon. Sophie couldn't explain it, but there was a sense of unease that kept tugging at her heart. It was small things, her parents' constant reminders to stay on the main roads. The way they would glance nervously over their shoulders when she walked home. Sophie had noticed that they were beginning to worry more than usual, even though nothing had happened. Her friends at school had begun asking if she was okay. But Sophie had shrugged off their concern, unwilling to explain her secret relationship with Shadow. One particularly chilly morning, as Sophie prepared her lunch for Shadow, she found herself thinking of the dog in a way she hadn't before. He was no longer just the stray she had found in the lot, he was her friend. Her protector. The thought of leaving him behind, of not bringing him food or checking on him, filled her with anxiety. Shadow had grown so attached to her that the thought of him being alone again seemed unbearable. When Sophie arrived at the lot that day, she was greeted with an unsettling silence. Shadow wasn't by the barrel, where he usually sat waiting for her. She stood at the entrance of the lot, looking around anxiously. The sun was barely rising, casting long shadows across the ground. But Shadow was nowhere to be seen. Shadow. Sophie called softly, her voice trembling slightly. She walked further into the lot, scanning the empty space between the old train tracks and the scattered debris. The wind rustled through the dry grass, but there was no sign of him. Sophie's heart raced, and she felt a wave of panic wash over her. What if something had happened to him? She called again, her voice growing louder this time. Shadow. Just as she began to turn, ready to sprint back to her house and get help, she heard a faint rustle. Sophie froze. There, in the corner of the lot, she saw him. Shadow. But he wasn't alone. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, stood beside the dog, his hands outstretched in front of him as if trying to coax Shadow closer. Sophie's stomach dropped. She didn't recognize the man, and something about the way he stood there, blocking Shadow from her view, made her feel uneasy. Shadow. Sophie shouted, her voice rising with a mixture of fear and anger. The man turned to face her, his expression guarded but not unfriendly. Hey, kid, he said, his voice low but calm. I think your dog's just fine here. No need to get upset. Sophie's heart raced as she stepped closer. Her eyes locked on Shadow. The dog's posture was different, tense, but not aggressive. It was as if he was caught in between two worlds, the familiarity of Sophie's presence and the uncertainty of the stranger's intentions. Who are you? Sophie demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. What do you want with him? The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked down at Shadow, his eyes softening. Just taking care of him, he said quietly. He's a special dog. Found him in the woods not too long ago. He's been a little skittish, but I think we've got it worked out. Sophie stepped forward, her feet trembling. He's not your dog. He's mine. I found him, and I've been feeding him every day. Her voice broke slightly at the end, desperation creeping in. The man's expression faltered, just for a moment, before he straightened up, crossing his arms over his chest. Well, I'm just here to make sure he's all right. I've been looking for him, too. Sophie's confusion deepened. What do you mean you've been looking for him? I'm with the local shelter, the man said slowly. We've been trying to get him back to his owner for a while. But it looks like he's taken a liking to you. Sophie's mind raced. Shadow had an owner. Was he really a lost dog? Or was he a stray? And if he belonged to someone, why had he been abandoned? The stranger seemed to notice her confusion. Listen, kid. I'm not here to cause trouble. We just want to make sure Shadow is safe. Sophie's heart ached. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she could trust the man. But she also knew that Shadow was hers now. She couldn't just hand him over to anyone who claimed to be looking for him. I won't let you take him, Sophie said firmly, her voice trembling with determination. He's mine. He needs me. The man looked at her, his expression softening. After a moment, he sighed and took a step back. All right, kid. We'll see what happens. But if you ever need help, you know where to find us. Sophie stood there for a moment, watching the man walk away, but she didn't feel relief. Shadow remained by her side, but the encounter had left her shaken. She had no idea what had just happened. But she did know one thing: Shadow wasn't going anywhere. And neither was she. As Sophie turned to leave, she whispered to Shadow, "We'll figure this out, boy. Together." And with that, they walked back toward home, Sophie's heart heavy but resolute. The bond between them had only deepened. The days that followed felt like a quiet battle. One Sophie wasn't sure she was winning. After the encounter with the man in the lot, Sophie had returned home, her thoughts tangled with worry and confusion. Her parents, noticing her unsettled demeanor, had asked questions. But Sophie couldn't bring herself to share the full story. She didn't know who to trust anymore. And Shadow was more important to her than anything. Shadow, for his part, seemed more protective than ever. He no longer waited by the barrel or remained in the shadows of the lot. Instead, he began following Sophie all the way to school, staying just out of sight behind the trees and bushes. His large, familiar shape always in her peripheral vision. It made Sophie feel safer, like there was someone always watching her back. Yet, a part of her wondered whether the stranger from the other day was still looking for him, still trying to claim him as his own. Sophie didn't know much about the man, but his calm demeanor, coupled with his insistence that he was from a shelter, unsettled her. Why hadn't the shelter made an official search for Shadow? Why had the man appeared so suddenly? As if he already knew where to find him? There were too many questions, and Sophie didn't know how to answer them. All she knew was that Shadow belonged with her. Every morning, Sophie snuck out early, careful not to wake her parents, and packed extra food for Shadow. She didn't want to waste any time, knowing that there could be another encounter like the one she'd had with the stranger. Her routine remained the same: pack the food, hurry to the lot, and spend time with Shadow before heading to school. It had become their secret, and Sophie cherished it. One afternoon, as Sophie walked home from school, she noticed something different. The air was heavy, thick with a stillness she couldn't quite place. There were no birds calling from the trees, no rustling of leaves in the wind, just silence. Sophie instinctively turned toward the lot, feeling the familiar pull in her chest. She hadn't seen Shadow today, and her stomach tightened with unease. When she reached the lot, her eyes immediately scanned the area for the dog. She didn't see him at first, but then, as if summoned by her thoughts, he emerged from behind a stack of old tires. His posture was tense, his ears alert, and his eyes scanned the lot with a sharpness Sophie had never seen before. There was something wrong. "Shadow," Sophie whispered, stepping forward. The dog didn't move, but he watched her with those steady eyes, his body stiff with caution. He was on edge, more than usual. Sophie's pulse quickened. Then, just as she was about to reach for him, she heard the faintest sound: footsteps. The unmistakable sound of someone approaching the lot. Sophie froze, her heart racing as she turned her head, trying to make out who it was. Shadow's body went rigid, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. A figure appeared at the entrance of the lot. It was the same man from before, the one who had tried to take Shadow. Sophie's blood ran cold as she locked eyes with him. His face was set in a hard expression, but there was no warmth in his gaze, just cold determination. Sophie instinctively took a step back, her hand tightening around her backpack strap. "What do you want?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving Shadow. "I've been looking for this dog," he said. his tone calm but firm. "I told you before. He's from a shelter. We're trying to get him back to a safe place." "No," Sophie said, her voice shaking but resolute. "He's mine. He doesn't belong to you or anyone else. I'm taking care of him." The man's jaw tightened. He took another step forward. But Shadow growled louder, stepping protectively in front of Sophie. The dog's large frame was a barrier between the stranger and the girl he had vowed to protect. Sophie felt a rush of gratitude for Shadow's loyalty. "Move the dog out of the way," the man ordered, his voice dropping slightly. "I'm not here to argue with you." Sophie stood her ground, not backing away an inch. "No," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. "Shadow stays with me." The man's eyes flicked to the dog. And then, to Sophie's surprise, he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I didn't want this to happen, kid," he said, his voice softening for just a moment. "But if you're not willing to give him up, we'll have to go through the proper channels. You'll have to answer for this." Sophie didn't know what that meant, but she knew she wouldn't let him take Shadow. "Not now. Not ever. I'm not giving him up," Sophie said firmly, her hand gently brushing over Shadow's fur. "I promised him I'd take care of him. He's not going anywhere." The man looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing his options. Finally, he let out a low exhale and took a step back. "Fine," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. "But don't think this is over. I'll be back." Sophie watched as he turned and walked away, his footsteps growing fainter with each passing second. Shadow remained by her side, his body still tense but slowly relaxing. Sophie didn't move right away. She waited until the man was completely gone, then bent down and gave Shadow a soft scratch behind his ear. "You're safe now," she whispered, her heart finally calming. As she walked back home later that afternoon, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get harder. The man had promised to return, and Sophie didn't know what he might try next. But one thing was clear, she and Shadow had formed a bond that no one could break. When Sophie arrived home, her parents were sitting at the kitchen table. They noticed immediately that something was off. "What's going on, Sophie?" her dad asked, looking up from his newspaper. "You're acting strange again." Sophie hesitated, her mind racing. How could she explain what had happened with the stranger? How could she tell them about the bond she had formed with Shadow? About the dog who had protected her? She didn't know if they would understand. And she wasn't sure if she could bear to let Shadow go. "I'm fine," Sophie said quietly, her eyes looking out the window. I just want to make sure he's safe." Her parents exchanged a glance, but said nothing. They were silent for the rest of the evening, but Sophie could feel the weight of their worry pressing down on her. She had no idea what was coming, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't lose Shadow. That night, as Sophie lay in bed, she whispered into the darkness, "You're my protector, Shadow, and I'll always protect you." For the first time in weeks, Sophie felt a flicker of hope. Shadow was with her, and nothing, not even the man from the lot, could change that. The days grew colder, and with each passing one, Sophie's bond with Shadow seemed to deepen. Shadow had become more than just a stray, he had become her protector, her friend, and her silent confidant. The lot, once a place of loneliness and uncertainty, had transformed into a safe haven for Sophie, a secret world where she and Shadow could exist without fear. But as the weeks wore on, Sophie couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was about to change. There were too many unknowns. The man from the lot had made it clear that he wasn't done searching for Shadow. And the last thing Sophie wanted was to have to part with the dog who had given her a sense of security she had never known. Each morning, Sophie would sneak out before her parents woke, carrying a backpack filled with food for Shadow. She was careful, always looking around to make sure no one saw her leaving. Her parents, while concerned, had grown accustomed to her quiet routine. They didn't question her early morning departures anymore. though they always expressed concern about the stray dog she had taken to feeding. They had even warned her a few times about the dangers of stray animals. But Sophie wasn't listening to them. Not when it came to Shadow. One afternoon, as Sophie was walking home from school, she saw the familiar shape of Shadow waiting for her by the lot. He was pacing, his movements more frantic than usual, as though something was troubling him. Sophie quickened her pace, her heart fluttering in her chest. "Shadow," she called softly as she approached. But the dog didn't immediately come toward her. Instead, he remained standing at the entrance of the lot, staring into the distance. His ears were perked up, his body tense. It was as though he sensed something Sophie couldn't. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and carrying with it a strange sound. Something she hadn't noticed before. Footsteps. Faint, but getting closer. Sophie's stomach dropped, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't heard anyone approaching, but the sound of shoes scraping against the dirt was unmistakable. It was as though someone was walking deliberately toward the lot, trying to be silent but failing. Sophie's hand instinctively reached for Shadow's collar, her fingers trembling. She looked toward the end of the lot where the fence met the street. There, barely visible, was a shadowy figure standing just outside the chain-link fence. The figure was large and stocky, and though Sophie couldn't see the face, she knew who it was. The man from the lot. Shadow growled low in his throat, his hackles raised. Sophie's pulse quickened. She had to move fast. She couldn't let the man see her with Shadow. Not now. Not when things were already so tense. Without thinking, Sophie grabbed Shadow's leash and tugged him toward the back of the lot. She moved quickly, her heart racing, as she tried to put as much distance as possible between them and the stranger. But she could feel him watching them. Feel his presence like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. "Come on, boy," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to go now." Shadow didn't resist, he followed Sophie obediently, though his body remained tense, every muscle coiled in anticipation. They moved toward the back of the lot, away from the figure, trying to remain hidden. Sophie's mind raced. What was the man doing here? Why was he following them? Sophie's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, the sharp crack of a twig breaking underfoot. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure had moved. He was no longer standing at the fence. Shadow turned, his eyes fixed on the movement. Sophie held her breath, barely daring to move. From behind a stack of old barrels, the man emerged, his dark figure casting a long shadow over the ground. Sophie's heart raced in her chest as she realized the man was coming closer, moving toward them with deliberate steps. Shadow barked fiercely, his tail stiff, and the man froze, startled by the sudden noise. "Get away from us," Sophie shouted, her voice shaking, but loud enough for the man to hear. Her eyes scanned the area around her, but there was nowhere to run. She was trapped. The man didn't speak at first. He simply stared at Sophie and Shadow, sizing them up as if calculating his next move. Sophie could see the frustration in his eyes, and for a moment, she thought he might make a move toward her. But then, something in Shadow's stance shifted. The dog growled again, this time louder, his body vibrating with the intensity of his warning. The man hesitated. He glanced from Sophie to Shadow, his eyes narrowing as though debating whether to continue his pursuit. Finally, he seemed to decide against it. With a grunt, he turned on his heel and began to walk away, muttering under his breath. Sophie watched him go, her heart still pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe it. The man had come so close to taking Shadow again. But this time, Shadow had made it clear he wasn't going to let anyone harm Sophie or take him from her. The air around Sophie seemed to lighten as the man disappeared down the street. But she couldn't shake the feeling that he would be back. It wasn't over yet. Sophie knew that much. She kneeled beside Shadow, who was still on alert, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. "You're amazing, Shadow," Sophie whispered, her voice filled with gratitude and relief. "Thank you for protecting me. Thank you for keeping me safe." Shadow's tail wagged slowly as if he understood. Sophie wrapped her arms around him, feeling the warmth of his fur against her cheek. She had made a promise to protect him. But it was clear now, Shadow was protecting her just as much. As Sophie turned to head back home, Shadow by her side, she couldn't help but wonder what the future held. She had to be careful, there was no telling how far the stranger would go to reclaim him. But for now, Sophie knew one thing for certain: she would do whatever it took to keep Shadow safe. He was her hero, and no one could take that away from her. The evening sky grew darker as Sophie and Shadow made their way home. She could hear the distant hum of the town winding down, and the familiar quiet of Maplewood settled around her. Despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, Sophie felt a sense of peace. She wasn't alone anymore. Shadow was with her, and that was enough. Sophie's life had slowly shifted since the day she found Shadow. What had once been a quiet existence, filled with the simplicity of school, chores, and playing with her friends, was now marked by the presence of a loyal protector. Though she hadn't planned it, Shadow had become the anchor she never knew she needed. But as much as she found solace in the companionship of the stray dog, Sophie couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease in the air. The man who had shown up at the lot, the one she'd seen lurking around, was still out there, somewhere. Every time Sophie walked home or headed toward the lot, she looked over her shoulder, waiting for the day when the figure would return and confront her again. It was late afternoon when Sophie left school, clutching her backpack with the usual mixture of eagerness and caution. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting an orange glow across the streets of Maplewood. Sophie's thoughts, as usual, drifted to Shadow. He was always waiting for her at the lot, and despite the warnings her parents had given her, she couldn't abandon him. He was her responsibility now. As she passed the corner of the schoolyard, Sophie felt a sudden chill creep over her. It wasn't just the cooling air, it was the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Sophie's heart thudded in her chest as she instinctively glanced around. A couple of people were walking in the opposite direction. But there was something off. The feeling grew stronger, like the weight of someone's gaze pressing down on her. Without slowing her pace, Sophie hurried toward the lot, determined not to let the unease overwhelm her. She had promised Shadow she would be there, and she wouldn't let fear stop her from keeping that promise. The shortcut to the lot was quieter now, the streets devoid of the usual foot traffic. It was almost too quiet. Just as Sophie neared the entrance to the lot, she saw him, a man standing across the street, leaning against a street lamp, watching her every move. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. It was him. The same man from before. The one who had caused her so much distress. This time, he wasn't hiding. He wasn't in the background, watching from the edge of the lot. He was right there, in full view, as if waiting for her. Sophie froze, her mind racing. She wasn't sure whether to confront him or run. She glanced down the street, looking for an escape. But the narrow alleyways offered no quick exits. She couldn't outrun him, not on her own. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Sophie saw it, Shadow. His figure appeared from behind the rusted barrels, his ears standing up, his eyes trained on the man across the street. Shadow's body was tense, his muscles coiled as if ready to spring into action. Sophie's heart raced in her chest. She hadn't even called him yet. But somehow, he had sensed her distress. "Shadow," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. The dog's eyes flicked toward her, and in an instant, he was at her side, moving silently and confidently, his large frame seeming to fill the space around them. Sophie bent down to pet him, her hands trembling slightly, but Shadow remained calm, focused. The man across the street didn't move. He simply stood there, watching them, his expression unreadable. Sophie couldn't tell if he was waiting for her to make a move or if he was just testing her. Her thoughts raced. What was his plan? Why hadn't he approached? Did he know he was being watched? 2. Without a word, Sophie took a deep breath. She would not let fear rule her. Not now. Not with Shadow at her side. She turned toward the lot and started walking. Her steps steady but quick. Shadow followed closely, his eyes never leaving the man. Every time Sophie looked back, the man remained where he was, his stance rigid, as though he were waiting for something, waiting for Sophie to slip, to falter. Sophie's pulse raced, and the weight of the man's gaze felt almost physical. He hadn't moved, but Sophie knew he was there, watching. She couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was only going to get worse before it got better. But with Shadow by her side, Sophie found a strange sense of calm. She could feel his presence, his steady loyalty, and it gave her strength. As they reached the entrance to the lot, Sophie paused for a moment, her eyes darting back to where the man stood. He hadn't followed them, but the unease in her chest remained. Was this just the beginning? Would he keep watching her until he found a way to get closer? Shadow stopped beside her, his head tilting slightly as if he, too, could sense the tension in the air. Sophie leaned down and placed her hand on his fur, feeling the warmth of his body beneath her fingertips. "We'll be okay," she whispered to him, her voice soft but firm. "You'll protect me. I know you will." For a moment, they just stood there, the wind rustling the leaves around them, the quiet hum of the town in the distance. Sophie felt a sense of peace settle over her, but it was fleeting. The man was still out there. She could feel his presence like an ominous shadow lurking just beyond her reach. Sophie stood tall, her resolve firm. She wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions. Not anymore. She had a new ally now. And together, they were stronger than any threat that came their way. As Sophie stepped further into the lot, she didn't look back. Shadow was by her side, and for the first time in days, Sophie felt a sense of security. No matter what the man wanted, Sophie knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't be able to take Shadow from her. Shadow was more than just a dog. He was her guardian, her protector. And as long as they had each other, nothing else mattered. As the days went on, Sophie and Shadow's bond only grew stronger. The once fearful and unsure girl had found in Shadow not just a protector, but a true friend. They had faced dangers together, and each day, Sophie felt more secure with him by her side. The quiet town of Maplewood, once so peaceful and predictable, had become a place where Sophie could thrive, knowing Shadow was always there to keep her safe. With the man who had threatened her gone, Sophie could finally breathe a little easier. But she knew that her life had changed forever. Shadow wasn't just a stray anymore, he was family. He had saved her life more than once. But it was the love and trust they shared that had truly changed everything. In the stillness of their home, Sophie whispered her thanks every night before bed. Shadow had found her when she needed him the most. And now, they would walk side by side through life's challenges. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Life Stories channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.